want to turn now to the race for a cure. We've seen a lot of promising news this week on the vaccine front. What do you make of the results from AstraZeneca and Moderna?
Well, it's very hard to characterize complex scientific things in a sort of simple to understand format. We don't know if these vaccines will work. We don't know if they'll work to avoid deaths. We don't know if they'll work to avoid transmission. That's why we're working on so many first-generation vaccines and a whole bunch of second-generation vaccines that, although they'll take more time, they are more likely to be extremely effective. It's great the U.S. government has been willing to fund vaccine manufacturers. Our foundation is partnered with them on that. That's something in my regular phone calls with Dr. Fauci, we update each other on, okay, how are we working with various companies? Which ones do we think we need to add to the mix there? What is the scalability going to be so that not just the US, but the entire world gets the vaccine? So yes, I am very hopeful in innovations in both therapeutics and vaccines. The advanced therapeutics will come first, but in 2021, probably in the first half, we're going to get some good vaccine tools, and that'll be a big milestone.
So next week marks a huge milestone. We have Operation Warp Speed is going to begin phase 3 for 4 of these vaccines. Right here in the US, they're trying to do 30,000 for each of those 4 vaccines, about 120,000 people totally. When will we know? How do we know if these vaccines are working?
Well, there's 3 things you'd like from a vaccine. You'd like it to be very safe in all the populations that you indicated for, no side effects. You'd like it to block transmission, and you'd like it to avoid the individual who gets the vaccine getting sick. The phase 3 endpoint is slightly different than those things so that we can accumulate events quickly. So we aren't doing it like a long-term vaccine thing. And even calling it warp speed is scary because it suggests that you're willing to make trade-offs against safety, which you should never be willing to do. The FDA is being pressured to allow what's called just a correlate approval. Fortunately, they've held the line on that to this point because we wouldn't know enough just based on the antibody levels. And, these trials, the bad news, of course, when we have many cases is good news for the trials in that they may accumulate events faster than they would have otherwise. But there'll be a lot of uncertainty about how good these vaccines are. The first generation, they said a 50% effectiveness, and they won't know the duration there. So these are going to be likely partial solutions that will improve over time. And so it's too bad people think that just that phase 3 approval will be the end of the epidemic.
Well, I want to ask you, you mentioned side effects. The side effects for the Moderna vaccine sound concerning. We looked. After the second dose, at least 80% of participants experienced a systemic side effect, ranging from severe chills to fevers. So, are these vaccines safe?
Well, the FDA, not being pressured, will look hard at that. The FDA is the gold standard of regulators, and their current guidance on this, if they stick with that, is very, very appropriate. And the side effects were not super severe. That is, it didn't cause permanent health problems for the things there. Moderna did have to go with a fairly high dose, and so to get the antibodies. Some of the other vaccines are able to go with lower doses to get responses that are pretty high, including the J&J and the Pfizer. And so there's a lot of characteristics of these vaccines. It's great that we have multiple of them. that are
Bill,
going out
everybody-
there. And yes, I think
You know the data
US
better than I do.
government-
But Bill, the data showed that everybody with a high dose had a side effect.
Yeah, but some of that is not dramatic, where, it's just, super painful. But yes, we need to make sure there's not severe side effects. The FDA, I think, will do a good job of that, despite the pressure.
How many doses of the vaccine will we need?
Well, none of the vaccines at this point appear like they'll work with a single dose. That was the hope at the very beginning. Maybe one of them, particularly in the second generation, won't surprise us. We hope just 2, although in the elderly, sometimes it takes more. And so making sure we have lots of elderly people in the trial will give us that data.
You've said some more than 7 billion doses. That's what we'll need.
Well, if what you're trying to do is block all the transmission, then you need to get, 70, 80% coverage on a global basis. So that, it's unbelievably big numbers.
I mean, you're talking about a global vaccination program without a vaccine that hasn't been fully developed yet, and a massive scaling up of how to produce one or several vaccines. I mean, it's mind-boggling to think about this effort.
But the private companies have stepped up. The science has been advanced. The U.S. funds biological research more than any other country. We've stepped up to fund these vaccine manufacturers. The plants are being worked out now. In 2021, there's a good chance this can get done. And because this is about the billions that we need to spend to save trillions and avoid all those deaths.
But who's going to get the vaccine first?
That's in discussion. Clearly, the U.S., by funding factories in the U.S., will get priority. But if we can have other factories, and this is where the U.S. government's traditional generosity in global health will be needed, our foundation will be needed, other countries. We want to make sure that we don't have people dying just because they can't afford to have access to the vaccine. And so that speaks to the top priority of our foundation. And there's good discussions going underway. The U.S. in this next relief bill may put 1% of it to make sure we stop the pandemic in the entire world, and then that'll draw other countries into that effort.
I want to ask you about today, the government support, taxpayer money that's going towards vaccine development. Today, we learned Pfizer is going to get nearly $2 billion. Moderna receiving $438 million in taxpayer money. And yet both companies have said they will not sell the vaccine at cost. They're going to make a profit on it. Should pharmaceutical companies profit off this vaccine research that taxpayers have helped fund?
Well, the Pfizer case is more of a procurement agreement than an R&D funding agreement. AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson have said they're going to use a non-profit construct. The exact contracts that were negotiated, I don't have access to. But yes, you'd want to balance the fact who's taking the risk and who gets the benefit of those things. It's fantastic that the research is being funded, and I hope those agreements in terms of pricing and access are very strong.
I mean, we heard from the HHS secretary say today that the vaccine will be free for Americans, or affordable. So that means the government will help purchase it from companies that are making a profit off of that we helped fund the research for. Do you see any problem with that?
Well, some of the vaccines are being done by companies on a non-profit basis. A few have decided, otherwise. And so if you have equivalent vaccines, the one that's the cheapest will be the one that we go with. And we may have, many choices here that some of which look like, the production costs will be quite low. So I do honestly think both in therapeutics and in vaccines we'll end up that it'll be a very clear deal, what should be purchased, and that'll be worked out. Whether people second guess the early buyer contracts, that's not really the key issue. We will get a good deal on the vaccine, and we need the world to get a good deal on it. And there are many of the companies have committed themselves to that.
Mm-hmm. The Gates Foundation is one of the largest funders of vaccine research in the world. Vaccines save millions and millions of people around the world every year. Are you concerned about a growing anti-vaccination disinformation campaign that exists on social media?
Yeah, it's always a concern because vaccines are so key to keeping measles deaths down. Vaccines helped us eradicate polio. Vaccines are so important. They've played the primary role in cutting childhood death in half over the last 20 years. That our foundation, the U.S. government have been very involved in that. So explaining how careful we are about vaccine safety is super important. During a pandemic, I can understand people's anxieties levels going up, but explaining what the testing is doing, we will need a lot of people to be willing to take the vaccine to stop the transmission.